You, Robert?
Zunius, they make so much space.
Real? Brazilian? Okay, I'll try not to move my face. Can you hear me, Eli?
Mm-hmm. Seems like a few people might not be able to attend today. Unfortunately, Zena said he couldn't make it, so we're sort of. Jimmy's here, so I'm not sure how useful I'll be for talking about this this chapter.
Sorry, I was on mute. It's not easy to read, is it? I was expecting just to be able to kind of breeze through it, and I kept having to reread passages. I wonder what. I don't know. Just more of a meta thought, like why is it so hard to grok this on first pass? But maybe I'm just dumb.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, it's
Well, here's a basic question. What does when he says he makes this distinction between the response function y sub x given u and the structure, or right? It wasn't clear to me. So, for example, in 10.1.2, we alluded to the fact that both probability of necessity and probability of sufficiency are global features of a causal model depending on the function and not on the structure of the process mediating the function. Didn't really understand what that meant.
So that's about whether there are intermediate variables and how that's set up.
Okay, so if there are no intermediate variables, then is y sub x u and structure equivalent?
Then is y sub x structure equivalent to what?
So is y sub x giving you and the structure, quote unquote, of the path between x, of the process mediating x and y, are those two notions equivalent if there are no mediators between x and y?
Well, I know it's hard for me to parse because like the structure is a graph and the process is a function. These are not the same. But I mean, I guess they kind of have the same information. Like the structure is completely. If you have no intermediate variables, then like might as well be in potential outcomes territory, not have a graph. There's no information there.
And does anybody have a good explanation of what this counterfactual dependence chain means? Like, what does it mean? I don't know what counterfactual dependence actually means.
I don't know. I mean, I think we probably have to go to the citation there, the Lewis 1986 paper, to figure out what's meant by that.
You think you need, like,
I'm
in a
not, I'm not
paper,
sure, like parsing
spend, like,
that.
you spent like 9 chapters explaining what counterfactual means, and then, I mean, you assume
Well,
that this,
yeah, I'm not sure what this sentence means, but I think that
I think it might be
Theory.
referring to contingencies and the idea of having to tweak and force some variables to like intervene on some variables before you can get but-for causation.
say it again.
we're hearing a lot of feedback from your answer. Can't quite.
And so, most of the actual causation definitions are kind of like variants of but-for causation, and they differ in how much you allow it to intervene in the world before you do the but-for test. And I think if you read dependence as but-for causation, like dependence, if I change X, Y changes, and the counterfactual is I have to do some intervention before that's true. And I think that I'm guessing that that's what that's referring to.
Okay.
I'm hearing a lot of feedback from your mic, Jimmy.
Sorry, I'm on my phone right now.
Oh, I
So
see.
mute.
So you want to wait for a few more people to join?
I'm not sure how many more people will join this week. Zena and Sam both said they couldn't make it. I don't know. I mean, yeah, I guess to return to your question, Robert, of why this stuff seems difficult. I mean, Jimmy and Zena are the sort of the resident experts in this. I know almost nothing about it. My impression I know almost nothing about this actual causality literature, other than some cursory reading this weekend. My impression is that and I guess this is sort of what Halpern says in his book, and what Pearl says in the conclusion of this chapter, is that there's no there's no normative definition of actual causality, and so the sort of the purpose of all these examples to place constraints on our definitions is to get whatever we come up with to comply with our sort of the natural language counterfactuals and those causal sentences that we produce. But it's sort of it's not immediately clear, like that there's a the sort of with counterfactuals in OCMs, right? There's a lot of sort of technical machinery that you have to build up, and jargon and stuff. But the definition is natural. It's sort of, in some sense, it's uniquely constrained by or uniquely specified by just the definition of structural causal models and of interventions. But I guess when you start talking about actual causality, there's no longer you've reached a point where the sort of algebraic structure of SCMs and Pearl's theory of counterfactuals is no longer sufficient to imply a particular definition.
Is it as though, like, right, it's kind of a feeling that I get when I work with Pearl and Halpern actual causality. It feels as though it's a level of, we're trying to express something using SCMs, and is trying to express the thing I want to express. It's that feeling you get when, so when kind of Pearl and Hopper updates their definition every couple of papers, and when you read through their descriptions of it and it doesn't feel particularly intuitive. And I wonder to myself, it's just like, is that just kind of writing style? Is it just kind of not the way he writes these things? Is it not kind of queued up in a way that makes it easy for people to understand, or at least people like me? Or is it that you're trying to shoehorn something into a shoe that's too small?
I think it's more the latter. And I remember that Hannah Chalkler, who is one of Halpern's co-authors in a number of papers, told me that she prefers, like, I think the 2005 definition. She finds it more intuitive than the 2017 definition.
Where do you stand, Jamie?
So-
Zena has expressed dissatisfaction with everything.
I mean,
All the definitions
so
are used.
in my paper on actual causation, demystifying dependence, it's like Daniel Jackson and I debated back and forth for like a full month on which definition, and
You muted yourself
when
there.
the school buses passed, we ultimately decided to use none of the Halpern Pearl definitions and instead use our own modified definition of but-for, where we actually wound up disagreeing with some of Halpern's judgments, including the basic brain sprinkler example.
Why did you?
Sorry,
Did you
what was the example you gave? You disagreed on what example?
So Halpern argues that if you have a sprinkler set up so that it turns on if it doesn't rain, then he uses contingency sets. So the rain caused the grass to be wet, but if the rain didn't come on, the sprinkler would. So the rain is not a but-for cause the grass being wet. So he uses a contingency set to try to kind of make his definition give the result that the rain, not sprinkler, caused the grass to be wet. But Daniel Jackson gave this structurally equivalent example where humans have different intuition, which is if I turn down the thermostat 5 minutes before it was scheduled to turn down anyway, you would not say that my turning down the thermostat was the cause of the room being cool. So you think it's an argument that the reason for the human intuition that the rain caused the grass to be wet is not that it actually rained, but more that we see the grass, like you actually look at closely the water. If you look closely, the water on the grass, it's going to be different if it's rain versus sprinkler, as opposed to if it's sprinkler turned on its own versus turned on manually. So we think that actually the model where you just say 1 or 0 if the grass is wet is not enough to capture the intuition. And if you set a finer grained model of how the grass is wet, then you can get but-for causation to work on the grass sprinkler example, and that's a better fit for the human intuition. You follow that?
So where in kind of, Pearlian concepts is the distinction? Are you saying that you've got, you take the same definition and get different conclusions if you apply it to two different SCMs, or you've got the same SCM and there's two different definitions?
That the human intuition is different when applied to two structurally identical SCMs.
I see.
And that therefore, one of the SCMs is not properly constructed to match in a way that captures human intuition. And it's a flaw in trying to construct definitions to give the human intuitive example on an SEM when the SEM isn't fine enough to capture the human intuition.
I see. So the formulation of the definition is confounded in this case by the presumed SCM that people have internally being different from the one that was used in the Malcolm Pearl paper. I see. So yeah, I mean, is that kind of do you think is that kind of an underlying driver of the of all of the various definition refinements and disagreements? That is it ultimately that
So the entire debate
the
has
SCMs are wrong
been,
and the definitions kind of don't matter as much?
but the entire debate has been, all right, here's a bunch of examples, here's some intuition, and let's try to refine our definitions so that they match the human. Let's try to refine our definitions so they match human intuition on more and more examples, and this kind of throws a stone in that whole approach, which is that maybe your approach is something wrong, not with your definitions, but with the way that you're turning the examples into SCM before applying the definitions. So that's kind of where this mapping remix paper that Zena mentioned comes in. So Strevens in that paper, he argues that you should apply but-for causation, but like across this like universe of like every possible SCM that you could use to describe the situation. I don't think that was a proper description, so as along those lines. And
Sounds hard.
holy crap, whoa. It's a very powerful and very different.
So is a corollary of this that we would actually expect a bunch of these, that there's some sense in which we would expect all of these definitions to coincide on like, could I go back, could one sort of go back and patch all of these motivating natural language examples in there and the accompanying translation into SCMs? Could one go back and patch the SCMs such that all the definitions coincide on all the examples in a way that isn't totally trivial?
I won't say that, but it's been well known from the start that there's a lot of ways to hack the SCM to get different results. So I think one of Pro Helper and favorite examples is he can construct this exotic example where someone getting his finger cut off at a factory is an actual cause of, actually no, I think it was a problem more with the 2005 definition that was not fixed in the 2015 definition. Anyway, but this is one of the problems that inspired the creation of normality, coordinates, and causality. So a guy gets his finger cut off in a factory, and then he goes to the hospital and gets it reattached. So the situation is that him getting his finger cut off in the factory is an actual cause under the specified definition of him still having his finger later, Because if it wasn't cut off, then there's a contingency where Larry the loan shark was waiting outside to cut off his finger and not give it back. But with the 2005 definition, even though there was no loan shark, you can imagine the contingency there where there was, and therefore, and under that contingency, him getting it cut off in factory as opposed by the loan shark is a but-for cause of him still having his finger. So there's a lot of ways to mess the SCM to get different results.
I see. Wow. Okay.
Are you working on the implementation of, I don't know, primitives or algorithms for actual causality in Omega or any of the other research projects that you have going?
So it's something that Zen and I have talked about for a long time, and I'm not sure where that currently stands. I know that at some point he went off and created another language that's not Omega, another language where he was going to explore a lot of this stuff, and I don't know where that stands.
Is there a language that you think would be, or say a high-level language used by machine learning people or data scientists that, you know, has developer conferences or, you know, a community of people behind it, it would make sense to develop some of these primitives just so we could get people using them and then kind of building a community around them?
You're asking if there's a machine learning language that's popular enough to have its own conferences?
No, like, yeah, something like maybe, you know, I guess Julia.
Yeah,
Well, it was already in Julia.
I was about to say Julia.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, if you know, Omega is great. I've always tried to, and I often point people to it, but I'm actually hesitant to, though, because it's research code and one doesn't know how it's going to be maintained into the future.
Yeah, definitely. We don't have the same resources as the Cautious group.
So is there any new computational content in any of these definitions of actual causality, Jimmy? Like, is a Omega style semantics for counterfactual sufficient to a sufficient substrate for implementing whatever any of these definitions of actual causality turn out to be?
I don't think so. You'd have to do an encoding where, so like so for the Cowper in 2015 definition, which is the one that I spent the most time with, you need to do a search. Then any way to do it is to do a 2-again search on all intervenable variables to force them to be the same as their original value, and that. Yeah, can't. That's something new.
I see. But then what does that imply about, does that, are there then computational constraints that are
Sure,
implicitly placed on possible definitions? Like,
I'll tell you that all these definitions have, the complexity of these definitions has been studied.
have or haven't?
Has. So for the 2005 definition, I believe it was a class called D2P or something like that, which I understand to be, you can think of it as solving an exist for all problem and a for all exist problem at the same time. Or if you will, it's the intersection, not the intersection, like solving if you know the polynomial hierarchy, solving a sigma 2 and a pi 2 problem at the same time, and exist for all problem and a for all exist problem at the same time. The 2015 definition, I don't remember off the top of my head. I think it's more like NP or incomplete. So lower complexity, but still not easy.
But do the complexities suggest constraints on the definitions? Like, if especially if we're attempting to match, if we're treating these definitions as models of a particular form of human intuition, wouldn't we expect some notion of tractability to hold? Or or conversely, could we study could we study human, could we study that the breakdown of actual causality attribution in humans as some complexity parameter increases, and use that to constrain our definitions?
That last part again, the breakdown of actual complexity. What do you mean by that?
Well, all these definitions are they're, as Jimmy said, they're fit to these examples, right? We make a list of funky thought experiments and come up with a definition that
Accommodates all of
satisfies
them.
all of them. So you might imagine if the goal is for the definition to match human intuition, you might imagine taking a set of examples of increasing complexity and understanding it, how
Yeah,
both how the definition scales with the notion of complexity and how quickly
I would
human
I
reasoning
would
breaks
say,
down.
I mean, and I would think that the more complicated a situation gets, the worse the situation is. So if I were to ask some really upstream question like, was the Clean Air Act a cause of the O.J. Simpson trials? That's actually be a very tough question to answer, but a lot of people would just say, "Well, of course not."
So, could you repeat the thing about the O.J. Simpson trial? I didn't hear that clearly.
But a very tough causality question, I think is actually very interesting, might be, yes. Was the Clean Air Act the cause of the O.J. Simpson trials?
What? What was the cause?
Was the Clean Air Act an actual
Clean
cause
air.
of the O.J. Simpson trials?
Is this a toy example in a paper somewhere?
No, I just came off the top of my head. That's I can very plausibly see the answer being yes.
Walk us through it.
Because pollution causes crime, and if they made the air cleaner than they did in the Clean Air Act, then it's possible OJ would have been less violent. Alternatively, if they hadn't passed it all, it's possible that a lot of other crime would have happened, or people who live in different places that could have sent the entire thing off course. But the Clean Air Act is something that has like very subtle global causes, and there's 15 years for it to have an impact on everything.
Well, that's an interesting example because it gets back to this this question of the model versus the definition, because you would expect there to be presumably the we don't have a good single an SCM that we could all agree on for this to answer this Clean Air Act O.J. Simpson question. So does that mean that is that then an argument in favor for this Strevin's definition you were talking about of including in the just taking but for causality and integrating over models, or
I think it might
does it
be.
mean
Yeah.
that we should just not care about examples where it's impossible to agree on an SCM, or we should rather consider them out of scope for a definition of actual causality?
I think it means that you should kind of take a grain of salt about how much about human intuition about actualization feature from any specific SEM.
I see.
Back home now, back in my computer.
It might make sense to kind of looking forward. Like if if we want to keep looking in the direction of, so wait, number one, here's a question: do we consider actual causality and explanations to be synonymous, or do we consider actual causality to be or the purpose of actual causality is to produce explanations?
I think it's an important purpose. So I do actually totally love the Halpern, Pearl Halpern, British Journal of Philosophy, 2005-ish, Structures and Explanations, since part 2, Explanations.
Part 2, yeah.
Have you read that?
Yeah.
Oh, so they say an explanation is an actual cause, not any actual cause, because there are many, but an actual cause that has a high explanatory power, given the listener's uncertainty in models of what happened.
Yeah, I think they defined it as probable actual causes, which has interesting. At least intuitively, it felt very close to kind of probabilistic programming, or maybe symbolic AI more generally. But yeah, I mean, the real question, I guess, then is, what are the purposes? So, Pearl often kind of constructs these legal examples, and I kind of feel as though, like, well, I don't see any courts adopting this anytime soon, so I'm not sure if this is the right motivating use case. And so I wonder if the motivating...
The legal people have a funny definition of causality. There is a famous case where, let's see, I think a police officer died because he fell off a bridge while chasing a suspect, and they ruled that was felony murder because the guy caused the police officer's death. But they wouldn't have if it wasn't a felony. It was just chasing off some guy that was just running it or something.
Yeah, and then there's a whole bunch of kind of morality that goes into it. So, for example, if you illegally, if you are, say, if you break into a building, a warehouse to steal some stuff, and you knock over a crate of olive oil, and the security guard who's pursuing you slips on it and breaks his neck, courts will consider that that you're criminally liable for that death. While it's very hard to kind of put a if you strip that of ethics, it's very hard to kind of find a formal definition of how that works as an explanation for how that person died. And so, like, going so from a machine learning or an AI standpoint, it seems interesting to me to say, like, okay, well, maybe we have to look at some of the explanation literature and see how we can, which, for example, one of the key ideas there is that an explanation depends on having a two interlocutors who have and there's a kind of a who assume a shared state of knowledge of the state of the world, and so you can formalize that quite well from an agent modeling standpoint. And I think you can map it back to some of the Pearl Halpern stuff by kind of saying like, well, I guess if everybody kind of assumes the same causal model, and then maybe we're getting in the ballpark there. But but of course, it's not going to be a perfect mapping, and so it'd be interesting. But that so
5 paper doesn't assume they have the same causal model. It
would
only
assume
assumes
that the
one
purpose
person has a probability distribution over causal models that includes the real one, where real is defined as what the other person has.
Yeah, and so like so I'm thinking, then what is the use case for actual causes if not explanation generation, which is a powerful use case. But if there's if actual causes are something that need to be studied independently of, in other words, if it's not for generating explanations, then what's the point?
Well, I did write a paper arguing that actual causation and dependence and software engineering are the same thing. And there are plenty of uses for dependence that are not explanation, such as doing change impact analysis.
Yeah, I think Halpern uses a lot of
Bug finding.
I didn't read it much, but it looked like there were a bunch of software and program verification related applications in his book on actual causality, which I guess Jimmy would know more about.
Yeah, I heard for so for fighting bugs basically, but verification, that would be interesting if that's true. Or rather debugging, not fighting bugs.
Yeah.
Should we read Jimmy's paper? I don't know why we're too embarrassed to read each other's papers.
I'd be happy to, I wouldn't say that.
I'd be flattered.
I'd be happy to look at it.
I'm actually, last night I finally started writing a blog post based on that paper.
Jeremy, do you have any thoughts on the paper? On the reading rather, the chapter?
Sorry, I was just on mute. I was so okay. You're talking about chapter 10?
Yep.
We're talking about the paper that James was writing a blog post on.
No one, or I haven't read that. Or
10. Chapter 10 of
Chapter
Pearl
10. This week's reading.
Yeah, so causal beams, man.
Well, apparently those are out of style.
No.
Not in style anymore. I can't imagine why.
Yeah.
Seriously though.
This is the chapter that convinced me that causality is immature fields. It's like I remember reading it, I didn't really understand it, and I got to the end. It's like, oh well, we're throwing all this out anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I understand why you went to causal beams, and I think I got the explanation, but of course it's really convoluted. And I agree with you. I think Zena, he's not here today, but he would agree that that there's a better way of doing this. And so the paper, I think that to me indicated that there is another way of doing causality that another way of doing actual causality that I think makes more sense is the counterfactual resimulation paper that I think that Rob, you've mentioned this a number of times, right? You know what I'm talking about?
Counterfactual resimulation paper?
Yeah. This is the by Jonathan Laurent.
Yeah. Okay.
Using Kappa, using biological networks, right?
So what's the connection to actual causality?
So actual causality in this case is token level causality, right? So we were saying yes, we have these rules that say in general cars cause, deaths, but what happened in this specific case, right? And that's what the kappa resimulation, counterfactual resimulation paper really does. It says, okay, we have these general rules, but in this specific case, what was it that caused the phosphorylation of our substrate? And the answer is actually, there's two answers to that. There is the actual causality, there's the actual series of events that enabled the phosphorylation, but then there's the counterfactual event that, had it not occurred, would have prevented the phosphorylation of the substrate. And that is really important because it adds to the story. So the point is that in this particular model of the counterfactual resimulation paper, you have some substrate that's binding and unbinding this other protein, and it'll just continue binding and unbinding until the protein that it binds to gets phosphorylated. And when that happens, then the unbinding slows down. And because the unbinding slows down, it creates an opportunity for a phosphorylation to occur when it's bound to this other protein. And so you want to talk about not only what enabled it, but also prevention nodes. And so he has this kind of counterfactual notion of prevention that says, had it not been for the fact that the other protein that it bound to is phosphorylated, then that prevented unbinding, which then and unbinding would have prevented the phosphorylation. So so that to me is a very concise notion of actual causality that is compatible with Pearl's notion, the Pearl style causal inference, but it also draws upon the concurrency community's notion of causality as enablement. And he extends it, that the concurrency community's notion of causality as enablement, with this counterfactual notion of prevention. And by combining the two together, you get something that I think could genuinely qualify as actual causation. That's much less obtuse than the definition that Pearl came up with.
So what is that? I'm sorry. What is the enablement definition of causality? Can you explain that?
Yes. So if you have a trace, you have a trace of all the events that occur, right? Then what you want to do is you want to subset that trace by specifically those events that enabled. Some events occur not because they were caused by the thing that happened prior to it, but because there was.
Well, what do you mean by subset a trace?
So can I just go ahead and pull up? Can I share my screen? Do I have permission to do it? Here we go.
Yeah, you do now.
Okay, thank you. All right. So let me just pull up the side wheel real quick. And I apologize, I'm talking about a paper that none of you guys have read except for maybe Rob. Actually, probably you have, James, too, right? Nope. Counter resimulation. Okay, so this is the enablement, right? You start off your initial state, and at some point later on, you bind, and at some point, because the substrate is bound, now it can be phosphorylated, and so that's the enablement, and just here we go. Here's the actual series of events. First, there's a binding, then there's an unbinding, then the kinase gets phosphorylated, and then it binds, and then the phosphorylation occurs, right? So we simplified this trace to this. So of all of these things that actually happened, it was the binding that was important because that enabled the phosphorylation. Okay, so you've somehow
first off, wait. So you have this trace here corresponds to a sequence of events.
Sequence of events that occurred in temporal order. That's right. But not necessarily causal order, right?
Okay.
Right.
Then,
some of these things just, like, so there's a series of, so just to back up even further, this is the initial state. So there's a mixture graph, which says that I have a substrate S and a kinase. And in the initial mixture, they're bound to each other. And then each protein also has the ability to be phosphorylated or not. So here's an example of a substrate that's been phosphorylated. Here's a sample of the kinase that's been unphosphorylated. And here's another case where the substrate is unphosphorylated and unbound, right? Here, at least that they're bound. And so there's some rules that say, all right, if this event fires, that means that you've taken a substrate and a kinase, and now they're bound. Here you've got an unbinding, right? So these are kind of reverses of each other. So this one takes two things that are unbound and binds them. This takes things that are bound and unbinds them. And importantly, the kinase here is unphosphorylated. And so you have another unbinding event that occurs when the kinase is phosphorylated, and that occurs much, much more slowly than this one. And that's important because phosphorylation only occurs, so the phosphorylation of the substrate only occurs when it's bound to the kinase. So if the if the substrate is not bound, then it can't be phosphorylated. Okay, and then of course there's the PK, which allows the kinase to go from unphosphorylated to phosphorylated.
So we have a bunch of like transition events
Yes.
that happen in some kind of temporal order. And
That's right.
These are state transitions that happen in a temporal order, and there's not necessarily flow dependence between all of these events, but
That's right.
between some
That's
of
right.
them. And so there's some kind of operation that allows you to figure out, say, what events needed to happen in order for another event to happen.
That's right. And the concurrency community is all in agreement that enablement says, okay, well, what set the precondition for this rule to be fired? Well, in this case, in order for this rule to be fired, then the kinase and the substrate had to be bound to each other, right? So what enables the preconditions for that? Well, what enables the preconditions for that is binding, right? So then it's a simple story. You start off unbound, you bind, then that enables the phosphorylation. Okay, so that's the concurrency community's notion of causality. What sets the preconditions for the rule to be fired? But that's only half the story, right? The other half of the story is that somewhere along the line, this is bound, fine, but then it gets unbound, then it gets bound, then it gets unbound, it gets bound, then it gets unbound. But then, while this is bound, at some point K, this kinase here, got phosphorylated. And when that happens, then U star can happen. And as soon as U star happens, then this unbinding event is much slower. So there's time for this phosphorylation to actually occur while it's in the bound state. And so how do you describe the notion that the reason why S is phosphorylated is because this PK happened, which prevented U from happening, which would have prevented P from happening. So that's this figure right here.
So if you had to articulate then what's, in general terms, what this definition of actual causality means, how would you say it?
So this notion of actual causality, the issue with the structural causal models is that they're all steady state. It's all at equilibrium, right? Whereas now we're actually running a dynamic simulation, and we're saying what were the events that occurred in this dynamic simulation that led to this particular event right here, P, phosphorylation of the substrate. And the answer is there's two parts of the answer. The first is the factual set of events, the enablement side. So this branch here is the enablement. So you start off, your initial state, you get bound, and then you get phosphorylated. The counterfactual statement says, well, what's important here is that PK happened, the kinase got phosphorylated. And because the kinase, and so then we consider a counterfactual world in where PK did not happen. In the counterfactual world where PK did not happen, then this unbinding would have occurred, which would have prevented the phosphorylation of the substrate. And so it's this disablement, which is always an even number of inhibitions, that is the explanation for P. So this is the counterfactual explanation for P. This is the factual explanation for P.
So why? So this looks like a perfectly normal DAG. What about this DAG implies that we need to reason about this as a dynamic, as a transient system, and as opposed to a steady state system, in order to understand it? I mean, in other words, so if, for example, we get a much more intuitive definition of actual causality from, so backing up, structural causal models assume that we're dealing with an equilibrium system.
That's right.
And we've commented that structure, trying to define actual causality with respect to and the explanations that they provide with respect using structural causal models is awkward, to say the least. And perhaps what I'm reading from what you're saying here is that kind of thinking about concurrency or thinking about a dynamic system might make it a little bit more intuitive. But from what I'm seeing in figure 4, this looks like something that could be expressed with a structural causal model.
Except, well, it can be expressed with a structural causal model, right? Of course, right? This is a token level, so that means that we have this is token level in the sense that this is an actual event that occurred, right? So I guess the difference is that these are not variables. P is not a variable, right? It's the event. P actually occurred, right? So this is a token level description.
So is it a variable on whether or not an event occurs? Like a binary variable. I mean, I don't know. That might. I think. Well, anyway, I see your point though. These aren't outcomes. These are events.
Yes, these are events. And so this event level description of what's going on is normally how the concurrency community thinks, but they only think about the right-hand branch, right? So it requires the semantics of counterfactual of structural causal models to even describe a counterfactual event. And it's the counterfactual event, this prevention branch right here, plus the enablement branch, that is a complete description of why did P occur, right? An explanation of why P occurred. And we can map this back to the causal beams, right? I think we can. Because, I mean, if you take a look at the example that he uses throughout chapter 10, it's this example of the shooting the canteen and the person dying of dehydration and what was the actual cause of death, right? And I think we could formulate that problem using the counterfactual resimulation methodology and talk about the enablement and prevention of the canteen problem. And use the causal beams, but now we have a much cleaner explanation because we just use this counterfactual resimulation approach, right?
Well, I think there are some issues here. I mean, we could express the composition of the continuous time Monte Carlo algorithm, the Gillespie algorithm, and the set of rules as a structural causal model.
Yes, it's just a very unrolled causal model, right? Because you're basically having nodes right. For every.
But this is not, it's if we wanted to talk about. I mean, that's the only way that we could sort of directly map anything formulated in the language of SCMs onto this into this rule-based setting.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, that'd be the right thing to do. And in fact,
we could ask about the we could ask for posterior samples from the counterfactual distribution of sequences of events, given that in the factual world we observe P, and in the counterfactual world we observe not P. And
PK.
where our counterfactual point of departure is intervening on not PK. I think we could do something like that. I don't know that there's a direct mapping between the these simulation models and it's a bit difficult to take the
so you may be right.
This language of models is in a sense more specialized than than a language of structural causal models or of probabilistic programs. We might embed one in the other. We might embed it in one, but not vice versa. So it's a bit difficult to take notions that are specialized to this context where the language has a built-in notion of physical time. And
Hey guys, I need to jump. I'll catch you guys next week.
Okay. Rob, before you go, I think the only thing I wanted to say was I think that Eli is right, that there's a fundamental difference between simulation-based causality and structural model, kind of declarative causal model, causality that's described in here, and that the main point of this paper is that they're really different, even at a very, very abstract level. And with that, sorry for keeping you, Rob.
And what are the implications of that towards kind of modeling? Is there a way, does that imply what we ought to do in terms of, say, making a DSL for kind of a simulation-based probabilistic models?
I think that's exactly what that implies. Yeah, I agree.
well, you could certainly embed a notion of physical time inside a language, with a notion of logical time.
Do you need to have the simulation require time be explicit?
Well, the mapping is exactly the one I described, right? You can take it's sort of like, including if everything were deterministic, it would be sort of like, including an ODE solver as a primitive in your language. ODE integrator that would allow you to,
right, or an SDE solver if you want it to be stochastic.
Some function forward in time. You can do that. I mean, in particular, you could take that and you could take something like omega and add a piece of syntax or augment the operational semantics with a notion of physical time, and then take whatever counterfactual semantics you define for the host language and extend it.
Yeah, actually, we've implemented this particular problem in Omega. So this counterfactual resimulation kappa problem where we have these rules, we implemented those rules as an ODE, and then simulated it in Omega.
Also, if you're using, I guess with do you need an explicit representation of time? I guess all you need is.
Well, you'd want to presumably one of the things you want to be able to do, one of the new kinds of operations you'd want to be able to do is to both to intervene and also to condition on an observation at a particular point in physical time.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, like, if I was going to define like a dynamic system, say, I could specify it as a set of ODEs, which has this kind of explicit time representation, especially if time is one of the variables. But so yeah, there you could also have, you could confine it to a set of models that did not, where you could just say, for example, define a bunch of rate laws for events that happen in between the kind of various particles of the system, and maybe constrain it so that there's no time dependence, right? So like, in other words, like the, dx over dt is not equals x plus t times y, for example. Like that, you would say, okay, that's illegal because that doesn't really make much causal sense, right? Like something being dependent on time directly doesn't really make much sense. But you could say, at least from a causal perspective. So, but you can kind of constrain the model such that you could define the system entirely in terms of just the abundance of other agents in the system or other particles in the system, and then time wouldn't need to be explicit, it seems to me, and that would be a pretty.
I don't quite follow, but you do need some notion of you probably do need some notion of time if you want to support conditioning.
Mhm.
If you want to say that we don't ever observe these systems in continuous time, right? We observe realizations in a sequence of discrete times, or sequence of particular times. So maybe we know the physical times of those, drawing posterior samples of the process given those observations. There are general algorithms for doing it. It's this idea called uniformization, where you introduce a bunch of auxiliary times. But it's
Anyway, I need to hop. Cool. See you guys next week.
sure. Yeah, see.
Cheers. All right, guess that's a wrap.
Well, so just quickly, what was the paper you were talking about that you were going to make a blog post of?
Demystifying dependence, the one that I argue with
Awesome.
app causation is the same thing as dependence in software engineering.
So I may be giving a short journal club on that paper this Thursday. So
Really?
yeah, still got to finish reading it.
What
But
club?
what was that?
What club?
So this is actually part of a internally funded initiative that I'm part of called Data Model Convergence, which is really about hardware software co-simulation. So you've got a lot of people who are like very concerned with like data flow, kind of architectures and how to implement things very efficiently on hardware. And you got a bunch of like domain science, domain people who are interested in solving a mixed interlinear programming problem quickly, and being able to get the two to talk to each other. And so it turns out the data flow people are very interested in causality already, and I think the demystifying dependence will give them a really strong anchor for how they can use it in their approaches.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
Want to invite me? I'll be glad to join.
Oh my gosh, I would love that. It's early our time, but it's not early for you, so that's good. Yes, I think it's 8:30 in the morning, at my time, which I guess would be like 11:30 your time, right?
That can work.
All right. Awesome. Well, that would be great. I'll just check in. I'll check in with Mark Graves to make sure that that's cool. But yeah, that's great. That's awesome.
All right, take care.
Take care, guys.